Greetings friends, welcome to my channel and welcome to today's new video. If you've never been here before, hello. My name is Brittany, welcome to what we have going on here. I would love it if you would join the Brat Pack by subscribing and hitting the bell. I put out new videos every week, both true crime and beauty related, and I would love to hang out with you. Okay guys, today's is going to be a little bit of a doozy, so I'm going to just pop open a claw right now. I don't know why I drank it like that, like a savage. I don't always do disclosures because I feel like if you're clicking on like a true crime case that has, I don't know, murder or torture, or anything in the title and the thumbnail, which is typically what I try to illustrate what's going on. But today's case, I feel like a disclosure is necessary. We're going to be discussing the abduction and the prolonged torture that eventually led to the murder of a 17-year-old girl in Japan. It's pretty awful. So I heard about this case when I was a teenager. I remember being on the internet and coming upon a post somewhere. God, the internet was so different then, but coming upon a post that just had her photo and then a list of all of the things that happened to her during her captivity and her torture. It was really bad. It lasted for 44 days and it completely shocked me. So recently I wanted to re-look into it and kind of get a full understanding of it. And it's honestly terrible. This is easily one of the most horrible and it's probably one of the worst cases of torture I've ever read about. It might be the worst case I've ever read about, so this is the warning: viewer discretion is advised. And now, with all of that said, let's get into the story of the 44 days of torture and the murder of 17-year-old Junko Furuta. So Junko was a 17-year-old girl in Japan in the 80s. It's reported that she was really bright, really friendly. She didn't smoke, she didn't drink, she wasn't that kind of kid, but regardless of her like straight edge kind of lifestyle, she was very well liked and popular with her peers. In addition to being bright and smart and well liked by everybody who knew her, she was gorgeous. And like, I'm gonna insert some photos of her so you can see, but she was truly just so pretty. So it came as no surprise with all of those things going for her and her looks on top of that, that she would be, you know, someone that the boys in school were interested in. One of the boys who was very interested in Junko was a boy named Hiroshi Miyano, who I'm gonna just call Miyano from here on out to help myself a little bit here. So Miyano was a totally different kid than Junko, on the opposite side of the spectrum, so to speak. At 18 years old, he already had a pretty bad reputation. He was known for being a pretty bad troublemaker, and not just your average bully, he was actually into some illegal activity. Miyano and his friends were actually low-level gangsters, I guess you could say, members of the Yakuza, and I had to look up what that was because I'd actually never heard of it, and I guess it's essentially like a gang. It's like the Japanese mafia. So not good. Not a good group to be socializing with, I think we can all say. So obvious differences aside, Miyano still, you know, had grown a little crush on Junko, so he asked her out on a date, which she turned down. I'm not sure if he asked her out more than once. I read some places that he did several times and some places that he just did once. It's really hard to tell when it's an older case and in another country, but he asked her out and she said no. That's the one thing that I do know. And it said that being turned down by Junko enraged him with his status and his like affiliation. He wasn't used to being told no very often, and people have speculated that this is what started the chain reaction that would eventually lead to Junko's death. So on November 25th, 1988, Junko was working a shift at her job, which was at an electronics retail store. She had been working there a little bit of time, and she was planning on becoming a full-time employee when she finished high school, which she was getting close to doing. This same night, Miyano, who we just discussed, was actually out with a friend of his who went by the name of Shinji Minato. So we have Miyano and Minato, but he sometimes went by Nabuharu. I'm just gonna call him Minato to save us all that just happened. I'm really trying my best here, but anyways, Miyano and Minato were out that night at a local park, actually looking for women to assault. They were known for committing gang rapes in the area, and they were out that night searching for potential women to attack. So I can't say for sure if it was a planned thing on Miyano's part because he was upset with Junko for turning him down, or if it was more of like a wrong place, wrong time situation. But while out in that park, the boys saw Junko on her bike riding home from her job at the electronics store. So on Miyano's command, Minato jumped from these bushes and kicked Junko off her bike and then just took off running. And when he did that, Miyano ran over acting like he was just there and happened to see it and like helped her up and was like, oh, are you okay? Let me walk you home to make sure you're safe. To which she accepted, probably because she had just been kicked off her bike and was happy to see a familiar face. Even if it was a face of somebody who... So instead of taking Junko home, which obviously that's not going to be what happens in the story, Miyano led her to an abandoned warehouse where he then proceeded to rape her. He told her, like, I'm part of the Yakuza. If you say anything to anybody, I'm gonna kill you and your family. So, yeah. He then took her to a nearby hotel where he again raped her, and after this interaction, he called his friends and bragged about what happened, and the boys all talked about the idea of keeping her so that they could all take turns with her since they were known as a group to commit gang rapes. So around 3 a.m. that night, Miyano took Junko to a local park where he met up with 3 of his guy friends. There was Joe Agura, who was 17 at the time, who later in life would change his name to Joe Kamisaku, but I'm just gonna call him Agura. 17-year-old Yasushi Watanabe, and I'm gonna call him Watanabe. And then a boy that I'm sure Junko recognized, Minato, the boy who kicked her off her bike. That's a lot of blush. So at this point, the boys went through Junko's backpack because she had it with her, and inside they were able to find her address written on a book. So at this point, they started to threaten her again, saying they knew where she lived and where her family lived, and if she was to try to escape them or get any attention to herself at all, they would have the Yakuza murder her family. With this threat and the fact that the boys were so much bigger than her and were easily able to overpower her, the boys then took Junko and they took her to the home of Minato's parents, where they were then going to keep her captive. The night she was brought to the house is the first night of many nights that Junko would be gang raped. As Junko was only 17 years old at the time, living at home with her parents and her 2 brothers, her absence was obviously noticed, and 2 days after she went missing, her parents filed a missing persons report. Unfortunately, the boys knew this would happen, and this is so gross. They made Junko call her parents and convinced them that she had just run away and was staying with a friend, and then convinced her to convince them to call off the police search. This call effectively ended any manhunt that would have been put into place to try to find Junko. So initially, Junko was forced to pretend that she was one of the boys' girlfriends whenever Minato's parents were there, because remember, they lived in this house. It's not like this was a random house that the boys owned together. This was Minato's parents' house where the boys just all hung out, so she had to pretend to be their girlfriend. But once the boys believed that they were safe and the parents weren't going to call the police regardless, this act ceased. And it's not said for certain that that's what happened, but there's no way that this kid's parents didn't know what was happening. Once you hear what they did to her and the severity of it, there's no way they didn't know. It's not possible. And it's theorized that the parents were afraid of their son and afraid of the Yakuza, which is why they didn't do anything about it. But the parents have never admitted that they did know. They've always said that they didn't know she was there. So from here on out in the video, I'm gonna be describing what these boys did to the 17-year-old girl, and it's very dark and it's very heavy and it's a lot, so this is that warning. Like, this is where it's gonna get very intense. So Junko was held in this house, which, by the way, wasn't in the middle of nowhere. It wasn't like an abandoned rural area. It was like a public area, like a city, where adults lived when it was happening and did nothing. And she was held here against her will for 44 days. During this time, Junko was reportedly raped between 400 and 500 times, and not just by the boys who captured her. They would often invite friends and other members of the Yakuza to come and take part in the rape and torture of Junko, and it said that she was raped by approximately 100 men. During this time, Junko was kept naked almost the entire time, and when these friends would come over, she was forced to masturbate in front of the boys and also their guests. In addition to being raped and humiliated daily, Junko was horribly beaten. They would tie her hands to the ceiling and use her body as a punching bag. The boys would take like barbells and weighted balls for working out and drop them on her stomach over and over. They would burn her eyelids with hot wax. They would smash her head into the concrete ground and then have one of the boys jump on top of her head. When Junko would eventually lose consciousness due to the severity of the beatings, because like this is some, you know, really intense stuff, they would then take her head and push it into water, push her face first into water until she would wake up, and then the beatings would continue once she was conscious. Didn't want her to miss a minute of it. The boys would force Junko to sleep out on their patio with no blankets, and this is during December and January in Japan, and it's said to get below freezing. And in addition to freezing her by making her sleep outside, they would sometimes make her spend time in a freezer. So all of this, by the way, his parents didn't know who lived there. The injuries to Junko's legs and hands were so severe that it would take her about an hour, they say, to crawl just to the bathroom, and eventually she wasn't able to crawl at all. The damage to her body got so bad that eventually she became incontinent and wasn't able to hold her, you know, her bowels and her urine, so she would go, you know, and she would then be punished for the messes that she would make on the floor. Junko was starved of actual food, but made to drink her own urine and to eat live cockroaches, and eventually her body was unable to consume anything, and anytime she would try, she would just vomit it up, and again she would be punished for these messes as well. I know I said that I already did a disclosure on the abuse, but I'm now going to get into the list of sexual abuse that she endured. I kept this part separate so I could do this again because it's really, really intense, so I just wanted to give another warning. So that's this now. So Junko had various foreign objects inserted in both her vagina and her anus, sometimes at the same time, including a hot light bulb that they put inside of her and then beat on her abdomen until it broke inside of her, scissors, hot chicken skewers, glass bottles, and fireworks that they would put inside of her and then set off inside of her. Her vagina was burned with cigarettes and lighters. Her breasts had been pierced with sewing needles, and then they eventually just took a pair of pliers and ripped her left nipple off of her body. Junko often begged for death, but the boys refused to end her suffering. During the time that Junko was in captivity, there were actually 2 separate instances where police could have intervened, but didn't. The first instance happened after a boy who was friends with the group had been over visiting, and while he was there, they had pressured him into raping Junko. Horrified with himself and what he had done, he confided in his brother, who then told their parents, because that kid, I guess, didn't suck. And his parents then called the police. So the police go over to the house, and Minato's parents answered the door, and they are like, hey, we got a report of some crazy stuff happening here, you know? And they were like, oh, there's no girl here. You're welcome to come in and search, but there's no girl here. And the officers declined this invitation because they said that the invitation alone was sufficient proof that there was nothing to hide, because if there was, why would they invite them in the house? At this point, Junko had only been missing for 16 days, which is still a horrific amount of time, and I'm sure at this point so many things had happened to her, but maybe she would have lived. Maybe she could have recovered from her injuries, you know? But they didn't go in, so they did not find her. Apparently the 2 officers did lose their jobs, and the boy who regretted his rape was, I believe, arrested, so there's something. So the second time Junko could have been saved was in December. Somehow she had gotten away from the boys for a moment, and she was able to get to a phone where she dialed the police. Unfortunately, she was caught by Miyado before she was able to say even a word to the police. And when they called back, because I guess they do that in Japan too, if you're on the phone with the police and the phone gets disconnected, they call back. Miyado got on the phone and was able to convince them that they didn't need any assistance, that it was a mistake. So the police didn't show up. To punish Junko for making the phone call, the boys poured lighter fluid on her legs and her feet and set her on fire, which caused her to go into convulsions. After the fire went out, the boys thought she had been faking a seizure to get out of the abuse, so they poured lighter fluid on her again and set her on fire again, and she survived this. So apparently towards the end of Junko's captivity, she was just in absolutely horrible shape, as I'm sure you can imagine, since they were doing these things to her daily. Her face was so swollen that she was basically featureless to look at. Her body was so destroyed from the beatings that, as I said, she was unable to eat or drink or hold in her feces or urine. So in addition to that, she started to produce like a rotting smell from her body, and due to this, the boys were no longer interested in her sexually, since a big reason they took her was to rape her. So they actually ended up going out and assaulting a 19-year-old girl while Junko was in captivity with them, but they let this girl go. Which, lucky her, to be honest, considering the type of people we're dealing with here. But yeah, she was no longer appealing to them sexually, so they went and raped somebody else. So January 4th, 1989, the boys decided to invite Junko to play a game of Mahjong, which I looked online and I feel like I've seen it before. It's like a game with tiles, but I don't really understand how it works. I feel like my mom used to play it on the computer when I was a kid. But anyways, they invited her to play this game with them, which she actually won, which is crazy, especially because she was like barely alive at this point. And she won the game. And the boys were infuriated. How dare she beat them? So they decided to take their frustration, Miyado specifically, out on Junko. So the boys beat her with an iron barbell. They kicked her and they punched her, and they poured hot wax into her eyes. They made her stand up and beat her feet with what I believe was a bamboo stick. And at this point she fell into their stereo and went into convulsions as a result of the beating. At this point, from the beatings, she was bleeding profusely. There was like pus leaking from her burns and her wounds, and the boys wanting to continue, they wanted to continue beating her, but they didn't want to get her bodily fluids on their hands. So they went and they put plastic bags over their hands and taped them at the wrist so that they can continue beating her without getting her on themselves. So they continued to beat her, and they took that, weighted metal ball and dropped it on her stomach over and over. And eventually they got tired of that, so they decided to pour lighter fluid on her. They poured it on her thighs and her stomach and her arms, and this time also her face, and they set her on fire. She's said to have tried to put herself out for a while, but eventually she just became non-responsive, and then the fire went out on its own. And this whole attack after the Mahjong game lasted for 2 hours. Apparently initially the boys thought that Junko was still alive, because oftentimes after they would beat her, she would pass out due to the pain and just be unconscious for a while and then wake up. But after 24 hours they're like, oh, I guess she is dead. We have killed her. Sorry, it's not funny, it's just, I feel like if you don't kind of like joke about things that are horrible, it's hard to talk about them at all. So when they realized that they had actually killed her, they were obviously afraid of being convicted of murder, so they decided they needed to get rid of her body. They first took her and wrapped her up in blankets and then shoved her into like a travel bag, which I guess is probably like a suitcase. And they then took her and put that into a 55-gallon drum, like one of those, you've seen it, Dexter, the Bucket Girls, that kind of thing, and they filled it with wet concrete. They then took that drum and left it in the night and drove to Tokyo, where they placed her and the drum inside of a cement truck. That was hard to get out. So after a couple of weeks, on January 23rd, Miyano and Agura were actually arrested, but they weren't arrested for Junko's murder. They were arrested for that rape that they did while they had Junko in captivity, the 19-year-old that they let leave. They were arrested for that rape. So after a week in captivity, the police actually started to question the boys on a case that was totally unrelated. Apparently they had a double homicide that they hadn't solved, and they thought that maybe these boys were involved since they were known to attack women. So they started questioning them separately, mind you, and kind of alluding to Miyano that they knew that he and his group had killed a girl, but they weren't talking about Junko. But in Miyano's brain, he's like, oh shit, they know. Obviously, Agura has spilled the beans, so he then admitted to what he had done and said that he could lead them to Junko's body. And I'm sure they were just like, what? What are you talking about? Because they had no idea, because she wasn't reported missing anymore. They didn't even know that she was missing, let alone dead. The following day, the police did discover the drum that contained Junko's body. I'm not sure how a cement truck would have been undisturbed for a whole week, but either way, luckily it was, and she was discovered, but she was in such bad shape that she had to be identified by her fingerprints. When she was found, her face was unrecognizable. She had glass bottles inserted in her anus, and even though her uterus was completely destroyed from all of the abuse, she was pregnant at the time that they killed her. So all 4 boys at this point were arrested, and it's so annoying because the boys were technically minors at this time. Their identities were sealed so that people didn't know who had committed this crime. They knew about the crime, but the public wasn't allowed to know who did it. But luckily, some magazine, I didn't see the name of the magazine, I'm so sorry, but they were able to figure out the boys' names, and they published them. They said whoever was sick enough to do something this terrible didn't deserve any type of anonymity, and I 100% agree. Unfortunately, all 4 boys took a plea agreement where they admitted to committing bodily harm that resulted in the death of a person, but not murder. And I don't know if I've ever actually heard of this. I don't know if we do that in the US. I think that would be considered like manslaughter, right? Or maybe second-degree murder, but I think it would be manslaughter. But they pled down, and we're gonna talk about the sentences now. And it's gonna piss you off. I just know it, so I'm giving you a heads up. It's gonna be extremely upsetting after hearing everything that they did to this little girl, this little high school girl. Hiroshi Miyano, the ringleader, who put this whole thing, he started it, you know the boy. He got 17 years. And he thought that was too much, so he actually appealed to try to get less time, and the judge decided, no, you know what I'm gonna do? I'm gonna give you 3 more years. So he got a total of 20 years for what he did to Junko. His family was also ordered to pay restitution to Junko's parents, and they had to sell their family home in order to do that. Shinji Minato was initially given 4 to 6 years for his part in the crime, but he too tried to appeal. These boys just love to appeal, and he too was given a higher sentence of 5 to 9 years in prison. Minato's family was not told that they needed to pay any sort of restitution, even though this was, by the way, the household where all of this took place. And after Minato was eventually released, because, 9 years isn't that long, he moved back in with his parents, who, by the way, were never brought up on any charges for their part in the crime. Yasushi Watanabe was initially given 3 to 4 years in prison, but he too appealed, and his sentence was raised to 5 to 7 years. And after he was released, he got married, and that's that on him. Now, Joe Agura was sentenced to 8 years. I didn't see that he tried to appeal, but I did see that when he got out of jail, he bragged about what he did. He showed no remorse. And on top of that, he was the only of them that I saw that actually got into trouble after being released from jail. He got put in jail because there was a man who he believed was having an affair with his wife. So he then went to the man, found the man first off, tracked him down, kidnapped him, drove him to his mother's bar, and kept him there for 4 hours, beating him, torturing him, threatening to kill him, and saying, "I've killed before, I know how to get away with it." He didn't get away with it though, and he was sentenced to an additional 7 years in jail for this crime. Oh, and in addition to the horribleness that is Joe Agura, His family was also horrible because his mother is said to have defaced Junko's grave because she, and I quote here, ruined her son's life. It's just, it's so dumb, and I don't know why these sentences were so light. I don't know a lot about Japanese law, but it was said that even, I don't know how to word this properly, even for the standard for punishment for these types of crimes, this was seen by the community as a light punishment, especially considering how violent this crime was and how long it lasted. You know what I mean? Like, during the trial, the judge said that Junko was murdered so horribly at the age of 17 that her soul must be wandering in torment. So that was the story of the torture and murder of Junko Furuta. Normally at this point I'd ask you, like, what do you think about this? But right now that feels like I shouldn't, like, why even ask? Because I feel like there's no way anyone feels anything other than just anger and just disappointment and frustration and just sad. Like, there's not really going to be a mix of opinions on this case, I don't think. There shouldn't be. I think we can agree that these boys were monsters and that their sentences were just ass bananas, dude. Like, how were they so light considering what they did? It was such, the sentencing was so lenient, and I just cannot comprehend how that could happen. It's insane to me. I feel so badly for this girl and her family, man. I can't imagine how terrible and horrifying and scary and painful those 44 days were for her, and I can't imagine how her parents feel, man, to know what happened to her and realize that the phone call she gave them, what, man, they have to know about her, they have to know about their daughter's final days, and they have to know that that phone call was faked, and I'm sure they live with that, like, I could have done something more, which they didn't know, but I'm sure that they live with guilt in knowing that they called off the search for her. Even if it is what she asked for, it wasn't their fault, but I can't imagine that they lived their lives without feeling like it was, you know? And I just, oh my God. The pain that she went through is just so disgusting and unthinkable, and I just can't wrap my head around things like that. I can't wrap my head around the idea that a human being could do that to another human being, could look into her face and see her fear and her pain and continue hurting her. I'm just so far removed from that mentality, you know? I have just this, like, mushy, gushy heart that couldn't hurt anybody, so to think of somebody doing that is just beyond my realms of understanding, you know? And it breaks my heart for her, and it breaks my heart for her family. And then the cops being able to intervene but not doing it, it's just so upsetting, but I don't, you know, I'm done with it. Anyways, guys, that completes this video. Please let me know down below of any cases you'd like to see me cover. I know these topics are tough to cover and they're emotionally draining, and it's not a happy thing to do videos on, but for some reason this channel change has brought me sort of, I guess, satisfaction, a feeling like I'm doing something, you know, and I don't know how to say it without it sounding weird, because it's not like, oh, I'm glad to be reporting on these horrible things, but I do like the direction my channel is going, so please, I'd like to continue doing it. Please make sure to join the Brat Pack before you leave by subscribing and hitting the bell. Any type of interaction with my channel at all, a like, a comment, a subscribe, a share, pushes me out into the algorithm, which helps me then in turn make more friends like you guys who are also interested in this, so I'd really love that. Thank you. And I just, again, you know, I want to thank you for being here when you can literally be anywhere else on the internet. The world's crazy, but you're tight, this is tight, and I hope to see you in my next video.